Since the beginning of time, history has been recorded in words and images, first on the walls of caves, with stories recited in the flickering light of ancient fires. Regardless of the medium, the power of narrative is what captivated audiences. So what happens when it comes to recording history? Winston Churchill said history is written by the victors, yet in an age of technology, history is written by whoever has the right tools and captures it on the spot. And while the speed with which events can be recorded is impressive, consider the fact that eyewitnesses are extraordinarily unreliable. One example comes from the Innocence Project. Misidentification is the single greatest cause of wrongful convictions in the U.S., playing a role in more than 75% of convictions overturned through DNA testing. So much for seeing is believing. So how can we teach history effectively to a populace that reads less than ever before and is increasingly impatient, eager to glean information in seconds rather than minutes or hours? One way to help students is to emphasize that history is shaped into some kind of narrative based on the writer's perceptions. Narratives have a point of view. There are characters and plot, conflict and resolution, foreshadowing and figurative language. These are the details that make history come alive. Let's start with George Washington. Gilbert Stuart's portraits have shaped our image of what the man looked like, yet those representations are largely of Washington as an older man. Washington is the central figure in Emanuel Lewitz's dramatic rendering of Washington crossing the Delaware. While the painting immortalizes a daring Christmas night victory, the details aren't necessarily accurate. Washington stands tall in the lead boat, bathed in munificent light. The American flag is one that was not officially adopted by the Continental Congress until June 14, 1777, months after the battle on Christmas night, 1776. The artist, German-born, was a passionate abolitionist, so he included an African-American as the third boatman from the front. Since the crossing began in the late afternoon of December 25th, the sun, if it had been out, would have set by then. Very little light would have been visible outside a few lanterns with candlelight. Diary of accounts of the crossing described terrible winter weather with rain, sleet, and snow pelting the troops. Ice would have formed in the Delaware on that frigid December night, but the ice that forms in the Delaware tends to be large, solid sheets that break into flows. However, in the painting, the ice tends to be depicted as ice caps and crags instead of the way the Delaware River still looks when ice forms. Another historic event, the ride of Paul Revere, is surrounded by misinformation, due mostly to the popularity of the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. By his own account, Revere's role was not as stellar as explained by Longfellow. Another poem, The Midnight Ride of William Dawes, written in 1896 by Helen F. Moore, lodged a literary complaint against the credit Revere received because of the Longfellow poem. History rings with his silvery name, closed to me are the portals of fame. Had he been Dawes and I Revere, no one had heard of him, I fear. No one has heard of me because he was Revere and I was Dawes. Artist Grant Wood's painting portrays the midnight ride in almost storybook fashion. Grant Wood grew up far from Boston in rural Iowa. He was enchanted by the story of Paul Revere, but in Wood's frame of reference, he pictured a local hero raising the alarm to warn neighbors of an impending tornado. As a primitive painter, Grant Wood's painting seems to capture a child's point of view. The New England countryside resembles a toy village, houses of simple geometric shapes, trees crowned with symmetrical green spheres. The windows of the houses are much too bright to be lit by candles, and the moonlight that spills on the settlement is fantastically brilliant, casting long, deep shadows on the road as if a spotlight is focused on the main event. Look closely at Revere on the galloping steed, flying, fearless, and fleet, in Longfellow's words. The horse bears an uncanny resemblance to a rocking horse. Another depiction of Revere in a portrait by John Singleton Copley predates the famous Midnight Ride. In 1768, Revere was famous as a silversmith with a flourishing Boston trade. Here Revere is shown as an artisan at a critical moment in the creation of a silver masterwork, apparently preparing to engrave the gleaming surface of the teapot with the tools in front of him. Though a working man, Revere is garbed in a spotless shirt and woolen waistcoat with gold buttons. The pristine, polished table is certainly not the typical scarred workbench. A thinking man, his hand rests on his chin as he gazes pensively at the viewer. The hand reflected in the finished work is a realistic detail that also demonstrates the artist's mastery. Another image related to colonial America comes from illustrations by N.C. Wyeth for James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. This novel was a fixture of American boyhood, a bestseller that shaped the view of Native Americans as the noble, savage. To prepare for illustrating Last of the Mohicans, Wyeth made 2 trips to the Lake George region of New York, where the novel is set. He tramped through the woods, did a little camping, cooked over an open fire. The artist admitted that he hadn't done a careful study of the American Indians who figured in the novel, but that what he knew about the lives and customs of native peoples came from books and stories passed down from his father. The novel takes place in 1757 during the French and Indian War, when the British and French fought over land that had long been home to the eastern woodland tribes. The image on the cover is Uncas, Hawkeye's faithful friend and one of the last of the proud Mohicans. Uncas is described as an upright, flexible figure, graceful and unrestrained in the attitudes and movements of nature. His eyes are dark, glancing, fearful, alike terrible and calm, the bold outline of his high, haughty features pure in their native red, the dignified elevation of his receding forehead, together with all the finest proportions of a noble head, bared to the generous, scalping tuft. The artist views Uncas from below, so he appears larger than life. He's bare-chested, covered in war paint, and crowned with a feather, though in the novel it states that Uncle was more than usually screened by a green and fringed hunting shirt, like that of the white man. Although the plot of the novel depends upon Native Americans carrying muskets alongside European soldiers, Wyeth portrays Uncas with a dagger, a tomahawk, and a bow and arrow, weapons of pre-colonial warfare. Moving from visual art to the written word, we experience history through nonfiction accounts and historical fiction. Whatever the genre, readers of history at any age can learn a lot by taking a close look at the books they are reading, starting with the cover. The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth Spear establishes credibility immediately in Random House's yearly edition by including the imprint of the prestigious John Newbery Medal for Children's Literature. The image of Kit Tyler, the main character, may lead in another direction, however. Attired in stark black and white with the stiff collar and cap, Kit may portray the image we expect, especially by wearing black and white. Contrary to popular belief, however, black was not the common everyday color donned by colonial Puritans, because black dye was expensive and faded easily with use. More common colors were brown or a brownish maroon, dull green, or tawny shades. It's not likely that Kit's hair would be streaming down from her cap, as women's hair tended to be pulled back, secured firmly, and concealed by the cap. The cover of Esther Forbes' classic historical novel, Johnny Tremain, features a boy on a galloping horse speeding down a neat cobblestone street straight out of a contemporary theme park. There's no mud, no garbage in the streets, no horse apples. 2 redcoats look on, along with a few neatly attired colonials. The boy's shirt is clean and white, as are his stockings. His shoes are neatly buckled with vest and breeches in coordinated colors. Like Witch of Blackbird Pond, Johnny Tremain bears the seal of the Newbery Medal, thus assuring readers of the book's merit, though the cover art might raise some questions in scrupulous observers. The front cover of William Bennett's nonfiction text, America the Last Best Hope, makes use of the familiar eagle symbol with a scroll declaring E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Various depictions of the American eagle throughout history tend to use the same symbolism. Eagle with outstretched wings, 13 arrows in its talons for the original 13 colonies, an olive branch in the right talon, a symbol of peace. In the Bennett book, the eagle rests directly on the shield, barring the reader's view of all the stars and stripes. In many views of this icon, the eagle faces the olive branch rather than the arrows, indicating a preference for peace. On the cover of William Bennett's book, the eagle appears to be inclined toward the arrows. Reading history like a writer is useful at the very beginning of a book. The opening paragraph of Witch of Blackbird Pond quickly establishes character and setting and even offers backstory at the same time hinting at or foreshadowing potential conflicts. In the first paragraph, the reader finds out the story is happening in mid-April 1687. A journey has taken place across the open sea. It has taken 5 weeks. We meet Kit Tyler, who stares hungrily for the first sight of land, and then lo and behold, a voice speaks in her ear. There's Connecticut Colony. You've come a long way to see it. The author sets up the story by introducing Kit's romantic interest, Nat, and his mother. The first page also includes Kit's initial response to America, which she sees as bleak and gray in comparison to the shimmering green and white that fringed the turquoise Bay of Barbados, which was her home. Witch of Blackbird Pond was first published in 1958, and young readers may find the writing style somewhat dull in comparison to today's young adult books. The same can be said for Johnny Tremain, which came out during World War II in 1943. Esther Forbes uses descriptive details to launch her story. She opens with a cinematic view of the setting. On rocky islands, gulls woke, time to be about their business. Silently they floated in on the town, but when their icy eyes sighted the first dead fish, first bits of garbage about the ships and wharves, they began to scream and quarrel. The lens of the writer's camera pans to hens scratching, clucking, and laying eggs, and then goes to cats in malt houses, granaries, ship holds. Forbes takes us through a cacophony of sounds as a colonial village wakes up for the day, and then the focus shifts to the people. Sleepy women, sleepier children getting busy with their morning chores. The roving eye rests on Fish Street as Mrs. Lapham awakens her apprentices. It is not until the bottom of page 2 that the reader meets Johnny Tremain, the young apprentice silversmith who gets swept up in the powerful currents that lead to the Boston Tea Party. Esther Forbes sticks to history in many ways as she writes the story, but it is up to the reader to determine which depictions are based on fact and which have been shaped to serve the arc of the narrative. While one might conclude that it is better to stick to nonfiction accounts of history, you still have to have careful attention to detail. With the William Bennett book, America, The Last Best Hope, Chapter 3, The Greatest Revolution, 1765 to 1783, begins with an introduction in the present tense. Taking this approach establishes an immediacy to the events that happened centuries ago. It goes like this. Parliament passes the Stamp Act. This notorious act of taxation without representation sows the seed of revolution and sparks an earth-shaking shift in colonial political allegiances. Bennett skillfully employs the language of a poet with the metaphor of sowing seeds. Vivid adjectives propel the narrative forward. Taxation is notorious, the shift in allegiances, earth-shaking. The verb sparks is an incendiary device. Following the introduction, Bennett reverts to the past tense, but begins to spin a tale that revolves around compelling characters. We first meet Deborah Franklin, who reportedly misses her husband. We discover some of her psychological underpinnings, including the assertion that she fears water. The reader also witnesses her reaction to angry crowds threatening to torch her house because of a mistaken belief that her husband, Ben Franklin, had a hand in framing the Stamp Act. Bennett uses a simile to dramatize Mrs. Franklin's nature. She reacted like a lioness to the threat of her home being torched. Bennett employs these and other elements of fiction throughout his book. Dialogue, for instance, is extrapolated from documents and other historic accounts. The reader of history, whether historical fiction or nonfiction, is advised to pay attention to details like these in evaluating accounts of the past, both visual and verbal. In the end, one might question the veracity of history. At the same time, we are awed by the power of narrative. So when students insist that they hate history, the logical question to ask is this. If history is so boring, then how come so much of our popular and cultural entertainment is based on historic events and real people?